Take him to the dungeons. Henry Ubeam spent the rest of the weekend in Cook's secret rooms. If you leave here, you'll get snatched, she warned Henry. And then where will we be? Someone in this place wants to get rid of you, you know. I bet it's Zeke, murmured Henry. He's never forgiven me for finishing his puzzle. It's Ezekiel, all right, said Cook. There he is, feeble, old, and at the end of his life, while the cousin he thought he'd banished forever has come back as a boy with his whole life in front of him. Henry couldn't help grinning. He must be in a rage, he said. Yes, and we don't want him to put a stop to the nice long life that lies ahead of you, do we? No, and yet Henry found it hard to imagine what kind of life it might be. Cook set about preparing a meal. Mrs. Bloor would be joining them later, and Henry helped to lay 3 places on a small round table in the corner. As Cook worked, she began to tell Henry her story, and Henry found himself curling up in the armchair by the stove and listening to one of the strangest tales he'd ever heard. Cook and her younger sister Pearl had once lived with their parents on an island in the north. Their father, Gregor, was a fisherman. When the girls were 5 and 6, it became apparent they were like Lucky Charms. Whenever they watched their father set off in his little boat, he always caught more fish than he could carry. Soon people flocked to the island to buy Gregor's fish. He became very rich and was able to purchase the whole island. He built a grand house with breathtaking views of the ocean and the sea. And around his island was always calm. This was because his daughters were endowed with luck and tranquility, so it was said. One day, a young man came to the island. He was handsome enough, said Cook, but there was something about him that gave Pearl and me the creeps. It turned out that he'd come to marry one of us. It didn't matter which. We were 15 and 16 at the time, and my father said, "Be off with you, Grimwald." That was his name. Be off with you. My daughters are too young to marry. They want to see the world before they settle down. Grimwald was persistent. I need one of your daughters. Now, he said, while she's still young. I want her for her pure, fresh beauty, for her sweetness and tranquility, and for the luck she will bring me. The young man's attitude annoyed my father. Again he refused, and then Grimwald began to threaten us. Cook tasted the stew before that she was cooking. More salt, she murmured. Go on, said Henry eagerly. Cook continued. Well, my father ordered Grimwald to leave the island, and eventually he went, but not before he turned his fury on us. You think you control the oceans, don't you, you little minxes? He said. Well, you don't. Very soon you'll find out that my power is far greater than yours, and then you'll come running to me. Both of you. Mark my words. If only we had believed him, Cook said sadly. A year later, Pearl and I left our island. We traveled all over the world. We dined and danced and met our sweethearts, both sailors as it happened. We came home to tell our parents and found... At this point, Cook gave a terrible sigh, and several tears dropped into the sauce she was stirring. Found what? Asked Henry. Found nothing, said Cook. All gone. Island, house, parents, all perished, drowned by the biggest tidal wave in history. We suspected that he could, but we weren't sure. And then when our sweethearts were drowned at sea, we knew it was Grimwald. Henry gasped. You mean he could? Oh yes, he could do anything with water. My sister and I parted. It was safer to travel alone. We were less recognizable. We went underground, took work in secret shadowy places where he couldn't find us. Wherever we went, we tried to improve things, keep children safe. One day I learned that Bloor's Academy needed a cook. I'd heard it was where the Red King once held court, and I thought I could help some children who came here. I guess that just like me and Pearl, if they were endowed, they wouldn't have an easy time of it. Cook licked the spoon she'd used for stirring, grunted approvingly, and put a lid on the saucepan. Henry would have liked her to continue, but at that moment Mrs. Bloor came through the little door in the corner, and Cook declared their supper was ready. After supper, Mrs. Bloor helped Cook to wash the dishes, and then crept away to her lonely room in the west wing. Mrs. Bloor is a very, very sad lady, Henry remarked, as he carefully placed Cook's china plates on the dresser. Sad indeed, sighed Cook. If she could go back to the way she was before her hand was crushed. Perhaps the time twister could help, Henry suggested. Cook darted a wary look at him. People can't go back, you know that, Henry. Yes, but in her case it would only be 5 years. And she hasn't really had a real life. Who would notice? Was all Cook said. Later, as Henry lay in bed, his thoughts kept returning to the time twister. Cook had no right to hide it from him. The glowing glass fixed itself in his mind so firmly, Henry couldn't sleep. He got up, threw his blue cape over his pajamas, and tiptoed out of the tiny room where he slept. Moonlight striking through the skylight lent a pearly glow to the objects in the room beneath. The china on the dresser glimmered softly, and Henry, looking up at the top shelf, saw a row of china mugs. They were decorated with bands of gold and silver leaves. 2 of them were placed closer together than the others, as though someone had moved one of them in haste. Henry pulled a chair close to the dresser and climbed on it. He still couldn't reach the top shelf, so he stepped onto the dresser itself. Now he could touch the row of mugs. The first one he picked up was empty. He replaced it and drew the second mug towards him. As he lifted it off the shelf, something rolled out and dropped to the floor. He looked down to see the time twister glowing beneath him. He smiled with satisfaction, but before he could climb off the dresser, a shadowy form ran towards the glass ball. No, Blessed, said Henry, recognizing the dog's dumpy shape. Blessed took no notice. He scooped up the time twister in his mouth and trotted to the door in the corner. No, Henry said. This isn't the time for a game, Blessed. They had been playing Chase the Cotton Reel earlier, and now Henry began to wish he hadn't been so enthusiastic. Blessed nosed open the door and disappeared. Henry leapt from the dresser, knocking over the chair, but by the time he reached the staircase behind the door, all that it could be seen of the dog was his wagging bald tail. Henry tried to grab it and slipped off the first step. Getting to his feet, he leapt up the steps again. At the top of the staircase, Henry found himself in a dark passage. He could hear the tap of Blessed's claws echoing somewhere beyond him and ran towards the sound. The passage curved in seemingly endless circles until it eventually led to a low door. The door was locked. Blessed had vanished. How could he have walked through a locked door? Henry stared at the empty passage behind him. He noticed a thin beam of light coming from a wooden panel at the bottom of the wall. Gently, he pushed the panel with his foot. It opened like a cat flap. Or a dog flap? If Fat Blessed could get through it, so could Henry. He knelt down and crawled through the flap. On the other side was a corridor with highly polished floorboards, gold-framed paintings hung from the walls, and a lamp with a colored glass shade stood on a small round table. A little further on, Henry could see a dark cupboard. He guessed that hid the door Mrs. Bloor used to visit Cook. As Henry tiptoed down the corridor, he could hear a voice. "Tell me," it said. "Speak to me, dog." Henry slid to the end of the corridor and found that it led to the landing above the hall. On the other side of the landing, a small boy in a blue dressing gown was talking to Blessed. He stopped talking and began to grunt and whine like a dog. The boy had white hair, and the spectacles he wore made his eyes look like round red lamps. Henry pressed himself against the wall, and watched. The boy was having no success with his grunting dog language, so he began to use words again. "Tell me, you stupid dog. Speak. Why won't you tell me where he is? Where's the boy from nowhere?" Blessed gazed mournfully up at the boy, but he refused to speak. "What have you got in your mouth?" asked the boy. "It's that thing, isn't it? The magic marble. Give it to me, and I'll take it to Mr. Ezekiel." At these words, Henry froze. So the boy was working for Ezekiel. He was about to creep away down the corridor when something happened. "Give it to me, dog!" The white-haired boy suddenly lifted his foot and kicked the old dog in the ribs. Again and again. Blessed groaned and sank to his knees. As the boy lifted his foot again, Henry cried, "Don't!" The boy looked up and smiled as Henry ran towards him. "You're him, aren't you? The one from nowhere." "Leave the dog alone," said Henry. "He's old. You're hurting him." "He's got the time thing, hasn't he?" "Maybe," said Henry. "Who are you?" "I'm Billy Raven," said the boy. "I talk to dogs. They usually answer me. I don't know what's wrong with this silly old Blessed today." At that moment, Blessed dropped the time twister. It lay between the boys, glowing softly. "Don't look at it," Henry warned. He didn't like Billy, but the white-haired boy was very small, and Henry didn't want him twisted into another century. "It's beautiful," said Billy. He bent to pick it up, but Henry kicked the marble away. It rolled across the landing and dropped through the banisters. There was a light ping as it hit the flagstones below. Billy Raven glared at Henry. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. Henry was tempted to run down and find the marble, but the other boy was giving him such an odd, sly look, he hesitated. All at once, Blessed gave a low, rumbling growl. The warning was too late. A hand came down on Henry's shoulder, and a husky voice said, "Well, look what the dog dragged in." Henry tried to twist away, but the hand was strong and held him like a vice. He turned his head and looked into the long, mean face of Manfred Bloor. "Let me go," said Henry. "You're joking," said Manfred. "Someone wants to see you very much." He pushed Henry along the landing. "Well done, Billy. A little present will be coming your way very soon." "Thanks, Manfred," called Billy. Manfred shoved Henry into a passage leading off the landing, but Henry continued to struggle. They reached a staircase, and at this point, Henry almost got away. But Manfred shrieked, "Zelda, where are you?" And a thin, long-nosed girl leapt towards them. She grabbed Henry's arm, almost wrenching it out of its socket. Henry let out a blood-curdling yell. "Shut up," said Manfred. "Zelda, hold him still." Zelda twisted Henry's arm behind his back. Manfred tied his wrists together with a length of sticky tape. "We'll need the torch," said Manfred. "Where is it?" "It's all right," said Zelda. "I haven't forgotten it." Grunting and struggling, Henry was led up the stairs, along dark passages, down ancient spiraling steps, and then up again into a part of the building he almost recognized. The place where he and James had spent their last miserable Christmas together. "We're not there yet," hissed Manfred. Up they went again. Up and up into a shadowy world lit by jets of gas whispering from the wall in their rusty iron brackets. Henry remembered the gas lights, but the walls that had once been covered in richly patterned paper were now stained with damp and hung with gray cobwebs. They reached a door, its black paint scratched and peeling. Manfred knocked. Henry's mouth felt dry with fear, and he could hear his own heart thumping in his chest. "Who's there?" The voice was old and slightly hoarse. "It's Manfred, Grandpa. And guess who else? I've got a lovely surprise for you." Manfred grinned at Henry. "What?" There was a delight shriek from within the room. "Bring it in. Bring in my lovely surprise." Manfred opened the door and shoved Henry into the room. Henry found himself looking at the oldest man he had ever seen. It was difficult to believe that the wizened creature in the wheelchair had once been his cousin Zeke. And yet there was something familiar about the spiteful hooded eyes and thin, cruel mouth. The air in the room was stifling. Behind the old man, logs burned in a huge fireplace. The floor was padded with many worn carpets, and the windows were covered by thick velvet curtains. "Well," said the old man. "Well, I never. If it isn't Cousin Henry." Henry tried to swallow, but there was a lump in his throat. He couldn't think of anything to say. Come closer," said Ezekiel. Manfred and Zelda gave Henry another push. He staggered forward, feeling faint. The old man was draped in rugs. How could he stand the heat? My. You are young." Excuse me. "Aren't you?" Ezekiel said resentfully. Henry tried to clear his throat. I'm 11, he croaked. At least, I was last week. Ezekiel scowled. Last week? You mean 90 years ago, don't you? Not quite, said Henry, feeling bolder. Not by my reckoning. Oh, not by my reckoning, the old man mimicked. Always were the clever one, weren't you? Well, you're not so clever now. Got yourself caught, haven't you? Henry nodded. So, where have you been hiding? Desperately, Henry tried to think of an answer. He knew he mustn't give Cook away. In a cupboard. In a cupboard. Where? In the kitchen, said Henry. No one saw me. I came out at night for food. The old man sniggered. This time, you came out too far, didn't you? Yes, said Henry meekly. What are you going to do with him, Grandpa? Asked Manfred. Put him in the attic, Zelda suggested. With the rats and bats. She cackled gleefully. The old man stroked his stubby white chin. Where's the time twister? He demanded. I don't know. The dog had it. Did he now? He's a good doggy, bringing his old master another present. He was very scared of that twister, you know. Ezekiel's smile was worse than his scowl. He had very few teeth, and those that remained were chipped and black. Henry reckoned that Blessed had just wanted a game, but he decided to let Ezekiel think that's what he wanted. So, where's my doggy now? Asked the old man. He had a bit of trouble there, said Manfred. Billy Raven kicked the dog, and he dropped the marble. Kicked? Shouted Ezekiel. Kicked my dog, the wretch. So, why didn't you get the twister, you nincompoop? Manfred sucked his teeth and answered curtly. You wanted the boy, so we brought the boy. Billy will find the marble. Tah! The old man spat into the grate. He'd better bring it soon. So, is it to be the attics for this one, sir? Asked Zelda. Until you can send him off again? No. Damn it. There's too much going on up there. Take him to the dungeons. Ezekiel swung his chair away, turning his back on Henry. Henry shuddered. Couldn't I stay here? I wouldn't be any trouble. I could live with Charlie Bone. He... Stay, screeched Ezekiel. Never in 1,000 years. Get him away from me. No! I can't stand the sight of him. All young and hopeful. Get him out! Henry was tugged away. Please, he cried. Don't do this. Manfred and Zelda pulled him out of the passage and slammed the door. While Zelda held him still, Manfred covered his mouth with a thick piece of sticky tape. And then Henry was dragged, bundled down to the hall, out into the freezing night. And the cold hit him with such force, he gave up struggling and allowed his captors to lead him across the frozen ground. The icy stars above gave the world a strange, pale glow, but the moon had disappeared. Zelda's torch threw a narrow path of light across the patches of snow, and although Henry could hardly see a thing in front of him, he knew where they must be heading. It was still a shock, though. When the great walls of the ruined castle loomed before him, he was pushed through the archway and then into one of the passages leading down out of the courtyard. Unlike the passage he had entered yesterday, this one seemed to be leading downwards. The ground was wet with mildew, and every now and again, Henry found himself skidding into Zelda, who led the way. Stop that, she snarled, or I'll drag you there on your bottom. Where was there? Henry wondered. Deeper they went. Deeper and deeper. The air was so thick and musty, Henry began to choke. The tape over his mouth made it difficult to breathe. Just when he thought he might die of suffocation, they emerged into a grassy bank. Tall trees reached into the night sky, rustling softly. Go on, said Manfred, giving Henry a shove. Henry tumbled down the bank while the others ran after him, giggling spitefully. They hauled him upright and marched him over to a black rock, half hidden in the undergrowth. Okay, Zelda, get to work, said Manfred. Zelda gave a crooked smile. She stared at the rock. In the dim torchlight, Henry saw her smile become a terrible grimace, as very slowly the rock began to move. Zelda was obviously one of the endowed. No ordinary person could have done that. With a rough, grating sound, the rock slid back, revealing a round black pit. Before Henry knew what happened, Manfred had pushed him to the edge. Go on, said Manfred. Down! Henry shook his head. Oh, yes, you will. Manfred gave him a thump on the back, and Henry trotted forward into a narrow stone step. Down, ordered Manfred, this time pushing Henry's head. Henry bumped and slithered down a flight of steps, desperately groping for something to stop his fall. At last he touched an iron ring driven into the side of the pit and clung to it. But even as he started to climb back up the steps, the huge rock crunched across the top of the pit. Henry was plunged into a darkness so deep and dreadful, he felt he must be dead. Roused from sleep by a noise in the next room, Cook found the empty mug and the upturned chair. She guessed what had happened. The flame cats were already scratching at her skylight. As soon as she let them in, they sped across the room and up the hidden staircase. They knew when a child was in trouble. But by the time the cats reached the landing, Henry Eubeam had gone. They had found Billy Raven peering over the banisters. As soon as he saw them, he ran back to bed. The cats found Blessed lying on his side and breathing heavily. Gently, They nudged the old dog to his feet, and then, with soft, encouraging voices, they eased his pain and kept up his spirits until he reached the place he called home. Now he lay at Cook's feet, wrapped in a blanket and half asleep. Poor dog. You paid dearly for keeping my secret, didn't you? Cook murmured. Thanks to you, he'll live, she told the cats. But somewhere in this godforsaken place, there's a poor boy who may not last the night. She buried her face in her hands. Oh, Henry, you foolish boy. Where are you? Aries couldn't bear the sound of weeping. With a gentle meow, he stood up and patted Cook's knees. Cook wiped her eyes. You're right. This won't help, will it? You'd better go and look for him, my dears. She opened the skylight, and the 3 flames leapt out into the dark. It did her heart good to see their bright forms streak into the night. What's become of the twister, I'd like to know, Cook said to herself. Has that wretched Billy Raven found it? As she closed the skylight, she heard the distant chimes of the cathedral clock strike midnight. Billy Raven was fast asleep in bed. Down in the hall, the time twister still gleamed in a corner. The door to the west wing stood slightly open, and now a figure emerged. Keeping to the shadows, the dark form slowly circled the hall until it reached the marble. The glowing glass sphere was lifted out of its corner and slipped into a deep pocket.